Human rights education aims to enable people to live human rights, to be protected by them, a protection that stems from an awareness of rights, a vigilance of how rights are questioned, threatened, or ignored, and human rights as a design for life, a way of treating oneself, treating others in an environment we live in now and in the future. So we must live, as Rui asked us to reflect on, we must live human rights education as humans. But there's something else. We must also live human rights education where others are human. And my main reflection under this idea of living in terms of our last days has been that there has been a shift from the very necessary and very deserved claps on the back that we had on the first morning, a shift from the aspirational, motivational language of rights bearers, universality, indivisibility, inalienability, I don't think I said that right, to a living where these terms, when we discuss them, are interfered with. They're made more complicated by perspectives, beliefs, politics, and ideology. So one of the journeys of this forum over 3 days, as I have seen it, is that the abstract human, what a philosopher called Costas Diogenes calls the pale human of human rights, has been given flesh. The flesh of ethnicity, of gender, of sexuality, of bodily differences, of religious identities, of socio-political status, of prison, of geography, and so forth. So moving from pale, abstract humans to real bodily humans has been a challenge for all of us over the last days. What do I mean by this? From my perspective, the discussion on the first day about universality and culture and human rights was a little bit overplayed. In other words, this discussion about how culture cannot be allowed to interfere with the universality of human rights. The issue here has not been culture, and the issue around human rights is often not culture. The journey has been about the extent to which, and in what ways, we imagine other humans as being human. Can they become human to the same extent that we understand ourselves to be? It was interesting, for example, in several working groups reporting on Thursday afternoon, that they pointed out that the first session on Thursday tended to locate human rights problems and abuses outside of Europe. It took several inputs and questions from non-European participants on that morning to draw attention to this initially, and Rui in his input yesterday. We are in a European context. We are in the context of a European institution that has real achievements and is a real witness and champion for human rights. But Europe, as the historian Perry Anderson points out, is also narcissistic. The problems are always elsewhere. It's also amnesiac, which was something which was pointed out in the Intercultural Dialogue group, where they argue that Europe cannot consider itself to be a mediator or apart from conflicts in the Arab world. It is part of them. Let me give you another example. Last month, the French police cleared something called Le Jungle, the jungle, a temporary camp, temporary people's homes, of Afghan and other asylum seekers, many of them unaccompanied minors. They cleared this camp by force. Many of these young Afghanis have now gone to live, as many Afghanis have been living for several years, in a park around northern Paris. European countries have bombed them into seeking refuge in Europe, and have done so in the name of human rights. And I think the consequences of this is something that we still have to grapple with. They are bombed and they are on the move in the name of human rights. So Europe bombed for their pale humanity, but when the real flesh of injustice and need and trauma and hope, some hope, enters European space, where are their rights? If we are right bearers, why did their rights not travel with them? Their rights are very alienable. Their rights are very divisible. These are the people described on BBC World last night as the immigration burden, as illegal people. So our job here in discussions over time, and it's a small job but it's an important one, has been to allow them and others to become human in our discussions. And this is one thing that surprised me. It was reflected on at length in the working group on gender equality and homophobia, but that discussions of power were not as obvious, not as manifest as they could have been. Rui provided an interesting key to this yesterday when he gave a human rights education definition that discussed people living in grids of power and domination, and the impact of these grids, which we can understand as connections, sets of connection, of obligation, of coercion, of interdependency. Some of these discussions were very alive in groups. I heard many groups discussing their frustration about trying to work or reaching out to work with people who may not even realize that their rights are being violated. But in general, the issue of power has crackled in the air without, and many of us know the pedagogy of Paulo Freire, without being named, without being unmasked. So for example, in plenary 2 days ago, when Rusha asked about visas, human rights and mobility, we witnessed another moment, another clash between the pale human, the abstract human, that has rights of freedom of movement, and people organized in an international system of mobility, a system of mobility and legitimacy, where race and class and geopolitics shape how and if you can move and organize more, sometimes useful human resources and sometimes not so useful and dangerous human multitudes produced by globalization into categories of legitimacy, who can move as humans and who can't. And if my language or if my descriptions of this are too raw, it is because the language that I use asks a question, and it's a question that has come back in many of the groups. How transformative do we want human rights to be? And how critical do we want human rights education to be as a part of it? You, I, everybody here. However, people do move. And as importantly, ideas and practices move too, and they cross borders. And the impact of that, the results of that, is something that we can see here in this forum. I've tried to illustrate this idea of becoming human somewhat forcefully. I'm happy to say that the groups normally illustrated it somewhat more creatively. I can give some quick examples around the issue of indivisibility. I was very much struck by the discussion in the social rights group about a housing project in Belfast that took aspects of the built environment and looked at it in a deprived area of rundown and neglected housing. And they looked at the damp on the walls and the broken glass on the street, and they said these are actually manifest human rights violations. These violate your social rights. And if you do not deal with these social rights, then the other rights, which are sometimes put in opposition to social rights, cannot be manifest either. So in this working group, David pointed out to us that the generations of rights are now equal in the international instruments. But thinking about this form of human rights education also changed our perspective. It let us understand what these rights mean and their indivisibility means in lived experience. Of course, indivisibility is also difficult to understand. Allowing others to become human is not just something uncomfortable, but also, as the group on environmental rights discussed, it asks the rich world to radically redefine how they live as humans. Rita quoted quite eloquently from Kurt Vonnegut's book Slaughterhouse 5, where he wrote, "I ask myself about the present, how wide it is, how deep it is, how much of it is mine to keep. How much of it is mine to keep? How many planets do I or we need? We stand for a moment in solidarity against world poverty, yet of course this forum here, physically in terms of the computers we use, the phones we are secretly texting on, and the clothes that we wear, all involve human rights violations somewhere else. And it's not only about people whose labour is not here. Here are coffee cups and teacups, which we have had every day outside. Just like the planet, there's a finite amount of coffee in the coffee urn. That's why we have the little cups for the coffee. But then we all, because we're human, pretty much want to use the big cups. Because after a few days, you really do need a lot more coffee. Each to necessity, big cups by desire. It's here as well in the small things. Perhaps that's why, maybe we need more coffee now as well at this stage, somebody said to me yesterday that actually this is exhausting. Discussing and thinking about solidarity is exhausting. And if it's not exhausting enough, I can throw in another one, discussed in the environmental rights group and the group on human rights education with people with disabilities. And that is, what are the rights of future generations? What are the rights of humans that are not yet human? And yes, my brain is melted at this stage as well. But we are human. The French philosopher Alain Badiou asked us, what do we mean when we say we live in one world? We're not really sure. Because if we believe that we live in one world, then we have to act as if we live in one world right from this moment. Everything we do has to reflect it, from using small cups to perhaps acting as if there are no borders. And that's a lot to ask of humans. As a short film the other day told us, we're clever, we are stupid. And that's why there has been some very interesting discussions in groups about how human rights educators think of themselves as ethical beings, as people who live, as people who need to live with humility, as people who cannot be role models, but have a role to play.